Hello and most welcome to H720. We're recording here in Lindum, south of Gothenburg, in the province of Halland. And I'm keeping my colleague up. He's off even more south into Halland to Helsjön tomorrow. So I will try to keep it short, not to make him very tired tomorrow. I try to expand, to make a pun here a little bit. I will leave some papers to Jan Eyskens in Belgium, even more south than we are now. And it's to do with space and the importance of understanding how space actually works. And what I mentioned that is that space itself has its own limits, qualities, traits and distinctions. We usually give qualities only to the objects in the world and say that space is inert, functionless, passive. At best, space is just background for the objects. Sometimes space could be a sort of a localization scheme to see where things are, and especially where they are in relation to each other. But space actually has its own qualities. And I think this model is very good here. And that's the Klein bottle interpenetrative character of space is here clearly shown. And you can also see that space actually has proper properties. It's not without properties. And those properties it has is, for instance, subject and object division. Also the creation of limits, borders, frontiers, qualities like density, qualities like lightness. Especially quantum physics focuses on space purely, whereas there are in quantum mechanics particles as one subdivision of reality. In the unified vision, the complementarity, we don't have objects. It's a pure opening to space. And space is the ultimate reality. And I think it's very interesting. I checked up for a while here. We were supposed to have a chat with Tia Kusim today. I don't know if you remember. He hasn't answered, neither me or Lars. So that has to be in the future. But I checked out Hopi language, but also some other interesting languages from Guinea, Papua New Guinea, I think it's called. It's an island off the coast of Australia. Wow, rather big, almost like Sweden. But they have languages where there's a lot of quality expressions for space. And that's mighty interesting because we human beings are very objects oriented. And interesting, there are languages that describe space, and that's the quality that space has. This was also something that was discussed by Stephen M. Rosen when he talked about apeiron. And apeiron could be the reason why the Western society doesn't give much interest to space. It's a sort of human-made division that cuts out space in itself. And there is a word for this weird thing, they call it apeiron, without really defining it. But you could say that our world and the apeiron together is the free open space. But by divide it, you shut out the access to both of them. So I found some traits of what we usually at a first level call our reality. And that's where we start. That's the starting point before we begin the process. And then we say that, like Newton, objects exist, but physical space is a complete nothing, a non-existence. Or in ordinary level 1 space, making room has become making a room. Lower space is a wall enclosure. And oddly enough, that was actually verbalized by Plato. I don't think these things needs to be verbalized, but it could be very helpful if somebody said it. Plato say that the objects are receptacle for something, a volume, and that volume is separated from the rest, and by not mentioning the rest it's made non-existent. And non-existent means three things: not having properties, not having any causal effect, and the third, being without value somehow. Don't have qualia, I think Quine would say. And what this causes is a sense of a very cramped character of this level 1 space, this three-dimensional usually coordinate system of Cartesian quality, and it becomes almost stressful to be in this object world. And inside of this we create between the made up objects causal connections, and they are usually linear. And this is the specific view of time as a line, and on that line you can put up the moments, and in each moment something is happening. That's a happening, and in between this you have a sort of causal effect. So that's cause and that's effect. In this case this is cause and that is effect, and that makes up a whole chain, and that chain is binding. It's actually a sensation in the body of being dense, not being light, not being free. And this is also the lack of expansion, taking in what's behind us, what's above us, and also this idea that we are enclosed in this little space. And of course this is also the starting point of going from somewhere to somewhere, and that is all binding. So one can say that this space level 1, or this lower space, is more or less the same as a constructive, no, constrictive influence that makes everything more dense, less movable. And this is of course the being of not being in flow, not being in the zone, everything going slowly, everything going out of sequel, being numb and out of sync. And for every time we add a new causal effect and a new from to, we are intensifying the complexity and the number of events of reaction, and this looks like a pressure cooker in the end. It's so many different chain of chains of cause and effect. So it becomes unforeseeable. We are losing the grip of where we're going. And this is this very, very clear sense of losing direction. Alexander points out this is development in its peak. It's a modern development. He said it started somewhere in the 19th century. But it's been going on since before, but it hasn't really acquired this force until modern times. And of course here, Alexander is accurate when he says it's technology at its peak that make the proper ground for making these effects much stronger. Not a necessary ground, but a possible one, because in other cultures you have technology and you don't have this problem. But it goes hand in hand with having a different background. They don't have our development of space as a nothing. And space is in a way similar to the subject. They are mirroring each other. And for being able to take in everything, this created reflective consciousness that I mentioned before, we can't really handle the full glory of reality, the presencing. Heidegger calls this the amnesia, the shutting out of reality. And that's an interesting way of saying it. I usually term it when the consciousness went up to the head, that was a process that was involuntarily. But it could also be that we voluntarily didn't want to have so much experience. Why that is, could be because we got stuck somewhere and we thought it too many opportunities, too much happiness. It's terrifying in a way because the opportunities are there. And I think it's in this ballpark where we start to localize ourselves. Especially Western man is constantly localized at a single point. The point of origin, the origo. But if you go a little further and try to understand more of this different helping tool, whereas the Klein bottle could be the most forceful one, space is ceasing slowly to be an empty container for things, inert, senseless, sterile. It becomes more personalized. You see, the traits that we usually in this lower space level 1, says only belongs to the human being, begins to belong also to the outside. This is the same process as we saw in antiquity, where the outside was made inanimate, dead. Before the trees had wills, the wind had actually a will, a force. The laws of nature were intentions. But once we're starting to divide subject and object, we deaden the object. They didn't no longer have force of having an intention or a way of moving about. They became bland and muted. The colors disappeared, and also in the same movement of this progress, the subject became more still. So what is the deadening of the object, making them less personalized, less human, if you want, if you like, or less living. Less living, maybe it's a better word. We also made ourselves less living by accepting the idea that there are dead nuns out there. Well, better that than dead nuns. I think that's a horror movie, The Dead Nun. But it's equally bad with dead nuns. Nothing becomes deadened, and our realm, which is actually space, the human realm is space. Space is needed for our bodies to function properly. We are made for space. But what happens is when we shut out space from our consciousness and creates the object, we make everything crowded. And that's part of this cramping the whole body and sort of tucking the head in neatly into the neck and destroying the balance of the back and the coordination of the limbs, arms and legs. So what can I say about this? Well, in our conventional understanding, space is just an arena for the objects and for the subject to behold. And implicit in this appearance is separation between subject and object, based on the interpretation that I am in space with objects. So we get two placeholders. One is the subject, it's outside everything. The other one is object, situated in a deadened space. And this space is the localizator. We use this space only to localize. It doesn't have any qualities, it doesn't have any energy, it has no difference, it's homogeneous. And of course you hear now, this is the creation of Newton also. He wanted a completely likewise space. Leibniz was one of those shock, but the commentary from Huygens was the more emotional one. He said, that space sounds absolutely horrendous. And of course it is. A space that we no longer know means that we can't have any qualities as human beings. We can't perceive anything. It's a little bit like in Heideggerian terms, we only settle for aletheia or theia. It doesn't matter what we pick. But it's the movement in between theia and aletheia that's the important. And by constructing the objects, we shut out that process. And thereby we're deadening ourselves. And I think this is mighty similar. I was listening today earlier on a very interesting discussion between Ian McGilchrist and John Cleese. And they get into this area as well. These muted modern times where we are dangling with objects everywhere. And they're always localized. And they even localized to that degree. So if you tell anyone that Heisenberg actually discovered the non-locale nature of reality, people get horribly surprised and say, oh, everything is localized. Well, where? And in reference to what? That's not clear at all. Those are riddles within riddles. I think it was John Cleese who mentioned, because it's been going on previous discussion between John Cleese and Ian McGilchrist, which I can recommend. But at some instant, John Cleese just mentioned, who on earth invented this idea of a now and here, like the utgångspunkt we say in Sweden, where everything starts. And people are so incredibly suspicious of not letting go of this. This is like a horrendous thing. And I'd say that from a corporate perspective, those people are all unbalanced. That's the only reason wanting to have an origo, is because exactly you are not yourself steady on ground with your body. That's the only reason. It cannot be any other reason, because it's such a magical invention. It's so far from perception. It's very way off, as I mentioned in the other lecture here. Are we tricked by reality? And in this case, it's obviously we who are tricking ourselves, because there's not a single indication from reality there should be like origin. We never see a cross or an X, if we look around, where reality starts and where there is a definite here. Actually, here and there and now and then stop to work, if we say that exists. Time itself dies. It's a misapprehension of what time and space is. And all space is in a way boundless, and it's infinite, but it also has boundaries, and those boundaries are not man-made. They come from space itself. There are boundaries in space, but we just need to let space do its own boundaries, and those are the ones we discover. This is from where we learn. This is the qualities, these are the properties, these are the characteristics of reality. And that makes our living journey into reality so much more interesting and enticing. Instead of living of these horrible objects that doesn't really have any qualities, and they don't even have a depth. So no wonder we become zombies. I think that's the subjective equivalence of objects. A zombie looking at deadened objects. Both are kind of dead. The deadness that are actually attributed to the objects turns up in the subject. And it's a coercive force that tries to make the whole world stand still in some way. And I think this standing still, the inertial point of reference, as Newton called it, the starting point of all starting points. This is also the absolute now, or the start, the big bang of everything. And by inventing that and firmly believing that, we get fixated, and in the end we don't have this smooth, seamless movement going from thea to aletheia, from implicit to explicit, at expansion and compression, expansion and compression. So this is what I want to say today about the expansion of space. And if you got the time, it's late now, I don't know if you will be able to watch this tonight, but if you go to bed, think of expansion. Think of empty space being vivid, not empty at all, full of characteristics. Just like they discovered in quantum mechanics, the space is incredibly interesting, and we can find so many qualities. By letting loose in this spaciousness and expanding, I think you could get a much nicer good night's sleep from that. More relaxation. And the interesting part, I think, is even in the thinking, because there's no difference between inside and outside. Your mind will let off some of its tensions when it comes to thinking, when they get area around the thoughts. And the thoughts can be space and also go back to space. And then they will be able to be truly specific and active. They're going to be very, very clear in the morning. So try that. Try to expand when you sleep. Well, I bid you all a very good night and say thank you very much. Bye bye.